Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Drivetime Podcast, the global auto tech podcast that puts you right up to date with everything that's going on in automotive, particularly with technology. This week I'm joined by Sarah Noble from Deloitte. She's the head of the UK automotive practice and she's a partner at Deloitte. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jackie.
It's great to have you here. Just before we kind of get into the episode, I've worked with you now for about 6-7 years and I've known you for a bit longer than that, but just give a little bit of background about you and how long you've been at Deloitte and how you ended up there, and then sort of your day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. So really lovely to spend the morning with you. I've been at Deloitte for coming up on 18 years now, actually, which is kind of hard to believe. And I'm a career consultant. So for better or worse, I have worked across kind of the consulting side of the business for over 20 years now. And that started in the US, where I worked with a lot of different transport companies and some public sector work. And when I transferred to the UK about 14 years ago, I started working mostly in automotive. And I've been in charge of our automotive consulting business now for the past 3 years. And the honest answer is it's a mix of, I don't know, I think when I was young, I wanted to try new things, and whether it's true or not, and I should probably reflect it's true, that I think when you're young, consulting sounds like, oh, really fun travel, a lot of different things you get to try, kind of figure out what exactly appeals most. And I would say that's been true for me. I've tried a lot of different industries along the way. I've definitely had some cool travel locations. And I think it's given me the opportunity to figure out what I'm most passionate about and what I like spending kind of my day-to-day working with, which tends to be the automotive industry.
So just thinking about consulting, expanding a little bit about because it's long hours, you're at the kind of at the coalface of how the industry really changes. So there's an element of let's understand what trends are going to be emerging, so we help manufacturers prepare for those. And also right the way through the whole supply chain, we have everything from the elements that go into the vehicle right the way to how you manage parts and after sales. So we're kind of touching many parts of that. But just expand a little bit about about the work that you do and how that's changing the way that people live and breathe with cars and everything else.
Yeah, and I think the key things I like to think about with consulting tends to be we get brought in when we can bring insights or expertise that a company doesn't have within their own business, and it doesn't make sense for them to invest in it for a really long-term piece. And so I always say if you want to be in consulting, you need to be like massively curious and a problem solver. And that goes regardless of whether you're working in supply chain, where I spend a lot of my time, or you're working kind of digital technology implementation or marketing, whatever it might be. And I think how that's then changed over the years as we work with the different OEMs and we think about the auto industry is probably historically we are brought in only to do kind of big technology implementation programs or much more operational sides of the business. I think most companies, and automotive included, have gotten a lot smarter about what their core business strength is. So where they have, the business themselves that they need to be hiring their own staff and they need to have the real expertise in-house. And I would say for a lot of OEMs, that is how the car is made, like what the actual car that they want to bring to market is. But the other side of that, which is changing so quickly, is, well, how do you connect to your consumers? So what are they looking for? And I think that's where we come in. We have a lot of deep consumer research we can help share and insights. And the other side of that is also like, what is the technology and the add-ons that a consumer will look for in the vehicle, but also pay for in the vehicle, which is a really key kind of question going forward. And then I think the other part where we play really important is how do we connect an ecosystem? And when I say that, I mean, how do we take what the OEM needs with the charging infrastructure, where investment is sitting with government, and kind of how do we help kind of that conversation come across all those players to both, we're talking earlier about communication, but also with where is investment needed, anything like that.
So where do you start? I mean, that's like massive. You've got all, it's like everything from consumer research and behaviour right the way through to connected vehicles. And then we talked as well about manufacturers are having to make decisions like years out. It's not just, oh, well, we'll make more of that thing. You have to make these decisions 20 years ago about what we're making and building and distributing now. So I know that obviously Deloitte, your business is chunked up into specialists that will focus on those areas. And you said you're being brought in when they have a problem they maybe can't solve themselves. So just thinking about when you first came into automotive, what were the big trends that you were involved with? Because I think those trends that you were involved with then will now be playing out, and then it's going to be what's coming next. So just kind of go back a few years about what was the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, oh gosh, when I think back over a decade to when I first started in automotive, actually a lot of it was how OEMs were structuring themselves to be able to reach and understand the key markets where they wanted to be focused. So there was a lot more kind of, when I say restructuring, like the resetup of how an OEM was viewed globally. So what are the markets they played in? How did they manage those markets? And early days of how do they rethink about like where they make the product and how they kind of bring that product into different markets. So kind of core supply chain, movement, distribution, manufacturing. I would say now, actually, to your point around, where things were made, you're right, those choices were made a decade plus ago. And we're now seeing those vehicles come into the markets as it was decided then. I think what's changed over that time is actually it's less and less about the vehicle itself. And when I say that, I mean kind of the sides and the seats and the doors. It's actually more about what are the electronics and the service that sit within that vehicle. And in many ways, that's more agile and faster to change. So a lot of the OEMs can make a choice on that much closer to release date and much closer to manufacturing than it kind of historically needed to be when the vehicle itself, and that's probably the wrong terminology, but like when it was kind of more the structure of it was what people are making a decision around.
Yeah.
Whereas now actually people are thinking about this as an extension of their phone, their computer, and what does that mean and how do they use it differently?
I think our whole lives are connected up anyway, aren't they now? So I have an app on my phone. I can check. I was saying last week, I've got this great thing. I can turn my car on from my phone.
Yeah.
But because it's a hybrid, I have to plug it in. It won't turn on when it's plugged in. So I have to go outside in the snow, unplug it, and then turn it on again on my phone. Like, oh, they didn't think that through. I mean, that was a great concept, and it works really well. It's just petrol. But yeah, so it's a hybrid, so that doesn't really work. Just coming back to something you mentioned about the connection of the vehicles and how everything is now connecting up. So when you describe, people used to think about, I suppose, the hardware of the vehicle, so the sides and the seats, and now it's more about connecting everything up and that being much more of an agile thing that we can do. What are we able to do now in vehicles, or what's the kind of the big sort of thing that's connecting us all, apart from having an app that means we can't necessarily plug it in? But in terms of connected vehicles, what are we seeing that we can now do without thinking about it inside the vehicle?
So I think it really depends on, there's a mass variety across different vehicles and different brands. But what I would say is it's more about how can your vehicle enable the lifestyle and the choices that you want to make. And so I think we're seeing everything from, more proactive thinking about charging, where you stop, but also, there's great examples where if you're on a road trip, it will proactively say to you, Jackie, you love Thai food. Are you aware that there's a Michelin star Thai food restaurant you're going to be driving by? Should we see if you want a reservation? And it can be that proactive in terms of whatever lifestyle you might want. And so I think it's more about what do consumers value and how much are they, as I said earlier, how much are they willing to pay for that value? And I think what we're seeing, honestly, is with a lot of the Chinese OEMs coming into play, that they're including a lot more of this as standard.
Yeah.
And so what are the choices that kind of the other, maybe more, longer term historical brands, what choices are they going to make alongside with that? And it really depends on if you're kind of mass market versus luxury at the same time.
So just, you mentioned new entrants, Chinese brands. I remember working with a group of colleagues. I was sort of freelancing about 20 years ago. And we were then working with battery manufacturing in China then. So I think talking about supply chain and the long tail that we see on it, the vision that was observed then, they could see that actually fossil fuels were going to deplete. We're going to have to think about another way of, moving people around, and mobility as a service is also now kind of, accelerating. What, in your experience, obviously you do a lot of work in supply chain, how are other markets responding now? And are we kind of behind? Are we ahead? Are we kind of catching up? Where is everything?
It's really interesting. We hosted a roundtable a few weeks ago um, within Deloitte and looking to bring together individuals from kind of the charging side of the network, from OEMs thinking about electrification, from private equity, where they're making choices on investment, um, as well as the energy businesses. And it was really interesting to hear that genuinely, probably the UK as a market is one, it's one of the best markets in the world in terms of a lot of companies coming and testing their business model. And two, actually, probably outside of maybe the Nordics, probably one of the most kind of forward in terms of being proactive about investment in charging and other areas. I think that said, the reality is we're a relatively small market in kind of the global footprint. And there's a lot of countries that are not making that same level of investment. I think it's not so much about the battery enablement, right? I think actually most OEMs are quite ahead and forward thinking in that technology, but it's more about all the different areas that we need to enable that.
Mm.
So, you told me a story earlier about struggling to find charging when you went away for a weekend. Well, actually our studies show that majority of people are making that choice on electrification based purely on whether they have on-street or off-street parking to that point. Like, would not many folks who are living city central who don't have their own kind of parking spot with easy installation of charging are making that choice.
Mm. There was I went to the SMMT Electrified event. I bumped into one of your colleagues actually
Yes.
last week, and that was amazing. When you see the investment in heavy truck as well, about how you start to drive the adoption of technology in every vehicle, not just passenger cars. I think we think about, in most of the world it's about passenger cars, but actually infrastructure has to support everything for final mile, and there's loads of different innovation coming out of, well, Amazon or delivering the final mile is, a huge piece of research. So that was a really impressive event to go to. And you mentioned private equity. There are so many startups now. Move 24 last year. There's another one coming obviously this year. But there was like a whole startup village of innovation that was coming into the industry. How easy is it for those startups to start to, because we're kind of dealing with in your world manufacturers that are very big. They've been criticised about being slow to change, but actually they're innovating at real pace to meet things like a ZEV mandate, which is again out of their control. So how easy is it to connect up some of these new technologies that are coming and innovation that's coming into that existing space of traditional OEMs and the kind of retail space?
It's a really good question, right? I think genuinely we would hear on a regular basis that there is a desire to invest in a lot of these startups. However, the reality is a lot of our ZEV mandate is driven by regulation. It's not driven by a consumer pull. So that creates quite a bit of hesitancy in a lot of private equity and other funding kind of vehicles to really want to invest in some of these startups, because the reality is they're looking for an investment turnaround that probably has some kind of payback in 3-4 years. And a lot of what we're seeing, especially when there's medium level / possibly low confidence in 2030, seeing that as an option. So it's really seeing that payback happen. I think there's a real lack of confidence in that. And that's creating some problems. I think you then go to the other side where I think quite a few OEMs are looking to spend a lot more time understanding how do they invest and maybe go into different joint ventures. And we've seen some of that by far in recent years, but it's still not their core business. And so them understanding kind of where do they make those investments, when the reality is with electrification, with changing consumer, with tough supply chain in recent years, there's not a lot of cash sitting in a lot of OEMs. So that ability to invest doesn't really sit there right now either.
No, and that's a good point. I think we see this all the time. It's it's an expensive route to market as well. So cost out is a really big topic, not just for automotive, actually for obviously everybody. So I just thought if we sort of come back to that area of how we sort of deliver transformation. So I think we've talked about EVs and supply chain, and the other part of your business is that kind of global consulting, and you're helping OEMs transform at real pace. So how do you approach global transformation? Because it's like a massive job. How do you think about, right, we're going to transform a whole industry? Where do you start with an OEM when you kind of go in the door? Where's it kind of first?
So I always think that, I mean, I would say, first of all, we don't necessarily start it. Actually, most of those OEMs have started their journey or have an initial first thought around how they want to go about rethinking whether it's their brand, their route to market, where they play. And so they bring us in usually for kind of spot areas that they feel like they need additional, for lack of a better term, kind of brain power to kind of work that through. And so I would say, for the most part, it's about, to my earlier point, it's about them being super clear on what those answers are for the where they play, how they want to do it, and what is the goals they want to get out of it. I think a great example would be recently having a conversation with an OEM and trying to get the board to understand the choices they make in terms of what their priorities are, whether that is volume, which most OEMs aren't in a volume play anymore, but really at making people understand the trade-off of kind of margin, revenue, what does volume play into that, the model mix, how all that fits together. I think there's probably a surprising more amount to be done to make sure kind of OEMs fully understand how all that fits together. And that's a big change, right? I would say until recent years, they very much have been, all of them, in a volume situation outside the extreme luxury brands. And so getting everyone on a different page with that is probably kind of one of the core new changes we're seeing, and making a choice around that strategically. It's then about how do they play into the market that they're going after. So whether that is, luxury brand, whether that is mid-market, who are the main competitors they want to go after, and there's plenty of perfectly solid players that aren't looking to be kind of the huge percent of the market. They really know their niche and they want to kind of maximize their capability within that.
I think that in the last 5 years has been, since COVID, probably, in my kind of observation, the biggest shift. So you talk about not having a volume play, and if any retailers will be listening to this, and obviously we play very much with the retail space, but connecting up OEM data into that space, we've seen that shift from different routes to market to that point. Do they sell direct to consumer? Do they have a wholesale model and use their franchise network to deliver a customer experience? I think the ambition of trying to deliver a better customer experience was the right one.
Yeah.
Because inconsistency across the network has always been a challenge, really, with if you have a brand and you invest heavily in marketing that brand, and then when someone walks into a showroom, that isn't the experience that you want them to get. It's challenging. That being said, I think we've seen the shift from, and this was really impacted in the supply chain space from COVID, so all the chips went into laptops and home working. So suddenly we stop the manufacturing. No one's gonna buy cars anymore. Oh, actually, they're all gonna want to buy cars, and we haven't got any cars. We've gone analog. So I think we've seen a real shift in now from like the push model, where retailers would be expected to hit their volume targets and volume bonuses by registering stock that there wasn't even a customer for. And that really upsets market valuation, residual values. We're just going to register something because it means we hit a target. So actually right sizing the market, even though it's painful, is probably the right thing to do, that you're manufacturing products that consumers will want to buy, rather than you have to manufacture because there's a production line just churning them off. So it's a real, do you manufacture because there's an audience, or do you manufacture because you've got to keep the factory lights on? I think that's been a challenge. So now that we've seen this shift more towards producing quality vehicles in a sustainable way, so you're not just flooding the market with stuff, do you see that trend continuing, or do you think I don't know whether there's a competitiveness to the existing OEMs against these kind of new entrants? Is there like we've got to, meet volume to compete with these people, or are we going to just manufacture in a cost-effective way?
It's a big question. So look, I think we're still right sizing is the first and foremost. I think we're definitely not close to being done with that. And the reality is we're going to continue to see some balance of playing purely based on what your consumers want to buy versus what you need to manufacture to find the break even. And again, that comes down to make and model mix for all the OEMs. The reality is, though, I think we're going to see a lot more making a choice that starts to move them towards the question of what gives them the most margin based on that choice. And I think we will start to see a lot more consolidation across brands. Like we saw some in the news that was potential when, there was an earlier in the year conversation on, Mitsubishi, Honda, Nissan. And that doesn't seem to be going forward. But actually, I don't think anyone was surprised to hear that there could be, big historical brands that are rethinking what that could look like in terms of their partnerships. And so I think we will see probably a lot more up and coming EV organizations. Whether they stay standalone for kind of their whole life cycle, probably not. I think probably most of them will at some point be merged in with some of like the larger brands. And that's probably how they're then going to see brands play. Because actually, most of the historical OEMs would have said with new EVs, they're either bringing in a new kind of brand name to cover that EV. So you think about Volvo and Polestar. And there's other examples of that actually start to be really interesting around whether, they did it by themselves, but actually they very easily could have actually just bought one of the startups existing out there. I think the reality is there's a lot more change to come in that space.
I think consolidation is inevitable, and we're going to see that as well with the new entrants. There are so many new brands and badges that it's a bit too much. There's like, where do you narrow down your choice? And I think consumers, and it'd be really good to just get your view on what do consumers look for. Is there any hesitancy? Because you mentioned early on that actually you have so much consumer research and insight that can start to inform the way that the automotive industry responds to that. So what are the sort of big trends are consumers looking for? And do we know, because we will come on and talk about this, how do we help consumers make the right EV choice because it's flipping the whole sales process on its head? But what are the big trends that you've seen that you're kind of working through with consumer behaviour at the moment?
What I would say around consumer behavior is there's a few key stats that always stick with me about we do a yearly automotive consumer study. And we look across the globe for that. And actually, so there's a global view, there's also a UK view, and we hit a couple other kind of key countries. Focusing in on a UK view, I think a couple things that hit with me are the fact that, one, quite a lot of EV drivers would go back to combustion engine vehicles. And I think that is really interesting to me around both probably they were an early adopter, they didn't actually have an entirely bad experience, but actually a lot of them would say the country isn't ready to enable my EV experience. Two, most consumers, when they make that choice of an EV, they change from a legacy brand they've always stuck with. So it's a completely different purchasing decision, which is really hard for brands, right? Because brand loyalty has always been huge in the automotive space. And actually, we now find that if I was going out thinking about my EV purchase, I would go across all new brands to consider that. I wouldn't stick with the car that I've always driven or the brand that I've always kind of made a choice around. So I think that's also really interesting and a real challenge for kind of legacy brands who want to keep people. But the reality is it's kind of like when we first went to smartphones, right? Almost all of us didn't stick with the same brand of smartphone or phone of any kind that we were with at that time.
Yeah, no one has a Nokia these days.
No. Actually, I can honestly say I don't know if Nokia has a smartphone, but
I've got a burner phone in my drawer that I always threaten my kids with. Like, if you don't behave, you're getting this.
I also just love that you have what you call a burner phone ready to go. Like, should life need it? And so those two are probably kind of the biggest. I also think there is still, quite honestly, there is still a bias towards range anxiety, which quite honestly shouldn't really exist anymore, right? We hear about it too much. The honest answer is it doesn't, like, you are fine. For 99% of drives and for 99% of people, there's not an issue with that. But we still hear that coming through. Probably the biggest one, though, is then residual values and what that looks like, right? There still isn't a particularly strong secondhand electric vehicle market. And a lot of those concerns haven't really been tackled, but probably still comes back to what does that mean in the buying process? What does the journey look like? And I think there's a lot of questions still out there around that.
Yeah, there's I think Zenith have now gone 100% EV on their fleet, which is interesting. So I think the space we now work in, where historically it was very much retail, it's now full cycle. So we do get to see everything around how do you manage the asset risk on that fleet of vehicles. So a couple of things you mentioned there, which I thought were really interesting, and that was if consumers could go back, they would probably go back to a combustion engine. And I personally drive a hybrid, which I'm really happy about because I kind of feel like I'm literally on the fence. Yeah. But I feel quite smug that most of my local miles are done on battery. So I feel cleaner and I'm kind of contributing to the planet one journey at a time. And also I'm spending less money at the pump. So I challenge myself to only fill up once a month if I can. If I have to do long journeys, I do. And then I don't tend to charge, on the way, because it's just not worth it for my kind of, hybrid mileage. But on that, going back to combustion, are you going to see, do you think, people moving back into hybrid or just, there's a couple of things, so there's residual values and also moving back to combustion. So I'd love to kind of just expand your view on those things.
Yeah, I think I would expect that we'll see probably more back to hybrid than kind of full combustion engines, I think, in fairness. So it's a fair clarification. I think the reality is just most of our early adopters would say they didn't have kind of the full experience that they were looking for with an EV. And so it was anything from maybe, there is still some journey to be done probably in kind of, as you say, the after sales. So what does that maintenance look like? How's that treated? What is the time off the road, if anything is needed on that? Against the fact that actually, despite, not feeling actual range anxiety, there is still a lot to be done in a lot of parts of our country around charging infrastructure. And some parts have fantastic on-street and off-street options, and actually some really don't, right? And there's a real gap in what that looks like. And so I think that's where you start to see a lot more of those choices being made. I think reality is probably more towards hybrid. And actually, probably most OEMs that have more heavily invested in a hybrid range are feeling quite smug right now.
Yeah. I think I heard an interview, it was Richard Hammond in a Canadian event. He was talking about synthetic fuels. And actually, we're now seeing motorsport testing synthetic fuels. So I think what you see, coming back to your point about charging, if you don't see it anywhere, your brain thinks it isn't here. Right. So your subconscious brain is going to be always looking, if you drive an EV, where can I plug it in? So it's not about range anxiety. I think it's about, where do I charge it? Where can I plug it in? Because you're absolutely right. Most vehicles now will do 99% of journeys without having to charge before you come back again, because the range is so good and battery technology has really advanced. But I think the ZEV mandate and the government now talking about actually including hybrid in that, so they feel like they're being a bit more flexible, because it feels punitive. Your point earlier on about OEMs being punished for something that's being mandated by a government, but there isn't enough of a consumer demand, feels a bit bonkers to me. So,
and consumers aren't happy, right?
No.
Like, that's not actually the range that they want to be able to make choices from.
Yeah.
I also think, I think synthetic fuels is interesting, right? The EU has obviously gone more towards that in terms of support of that in their regulations. I also just think, realistically, we have to be driven more by what consumers want. And alongside that, you made a really interesting point around, like, you make choices, whether or not you charge on the journey. Related to that, a point that I know you and I are really dear to. Well, actually, if you think about kind of safety inclusion, well, actually quite a lot. I think Fleet News in the recent year or two did a whole article on the fact that actually a lot of charging is in the back, not well lit. It's kind of around the corner where no one might see you. And so actually, if you're a female, young, minority on your own, that isn't necessarily a situation you want to put yourself into when you have to spend whatever amount of time charging your vehicle in the dark, in the back, if it's late at night, right? And so maybe no one's thinking about that when they make the choice, but actually when you start to then live that life, actually that can become a real aspect of what you're making your kind of decisions around.
I think if you haven't ever, when I grew up, I used to live, you had to walk through an alley to get to where I lived. So like all the places you're told never to go, around the back, in the dark, on your own. You're like, I wouldn't go there. I was raised never to go down that alley or to be in that place. So like, yeah, you're right. We do need to think about it differently to make sure that we have safe charging for everybody. And I don't think, it isn't just, I've got young boys as well. So where they, to be fair, when your kids pass their driving test, there's no way they can afford an EV, no. Frankly, let alone. And I have one charging point at home, so we'd all be like, trying to, it's like the phone charger, who's next to my phone charger, like who's using the bloody car charger. So we're going to have to future-proof ourselves a little bit for what's coming next. But you're right, it's you've got to think about choices for consumers. So when you say that consumers aren't ready for it, what do you think that's just a timing thing, or do you think it's just there's so many different factors in that?
I think one of the other areas that came out of our roundtable that we did was very much around the fact that actually, we say maybe consumers aren't, I'm not sure if ready is the term I'd use, but consumers definitely aren't pushing for it. And actually, probably a really large portion of that is lack of kind of clear communication over what the experience is. So, for example, gossip would say that it's still range anxiety. Well, actually, that's really been addressed.
Hmm.
But probably most people, if I talk to them on the street, would still say that, having no idea what the actual range is of an electric vehicle, having no idea how much they actually drive in a day or a week. And so there's definitely an aspect of that. There's also a lot to be said for energy companies, probably are leading the way in a lot of this in terms of thinking about tariffs that allow for less expensive charging at home. Again, should you have off-street parking? There's a lot of views that, how you charge, getting set up for charging. Well, actually, regulation has now passed that every charging has to have a contactless payment if you're on public charging. So actually, a lot of this is being worked through really proactively now. Well, maybe not so proactively, but it's happening now. And a lot of that but the communication out to actual consumers on the street, I think, is really lacking in
Yeah,
terms
you're
of the
right.
whole picture for them.
So I think that's where retail, and we've got in a couple of episodes, we're going to have She's Electric coming on to talk about the events that they run and how they start to help. So one area that I think is a massive opportunity that maybe with how OEMs can help retailers do this better is kind of giving that information, because you mentioned Fleet News is one of the trade publications that weirdly I used to work at years ago, but they talk a lot about regulation and taxation, and there's so much detail and data. And you try and explain or ask a retailer to explain the difference between, we all understand pence per mile. I grew up in pence per gallon, or now obviously it's pence per litre. And you look at the pump and you make a decision when you drive in as a consumer about, well, I'll keep driving. I'll go to my Morrison's nearby because it's always the cheapest. I will drive through that junction to go to that place to fill up, because I'll fill up once a month maybe. That's my challenge to myself. But we know where the cheapest place is to fill up. So how we then communicate from the retailers what the difference is for a consumer if they're considering an EV. So it'd be good to just talk about this as a separate thing, is how do we think differently about helping consumers make that informed decision if the retailer sales teams don't understand how to explain cost per kilowatt hour versus pence per litre. So I think that's the bit where we see Auto Trader talk about, I think it's Erin talks about whatever it is, pence per day to charge. And it's the ability to simplify that messaging, I think. So where we've seen it done really well, when the iPod was first launched, it was 1,000 songs in your pocket. It's not talking about the memory, because that's really, I'm not going to know how many gigawatts of memory. What does that mean? So in the same, if you look at your tariff charging day or night, I actually couldn't tell you what it cost me to charge it. If I plug it in a day because I've forgotten to charge it at night, sometimes I'll just stick it on a charge for 2 hours so I can go and do a school run or pick my son up from the station. But I normally plug it in overnight and it automates when it charges at the cheaper tariff. So what are manufacturers doing anything around how they help retailers explain that? Or is there something we can do as an industry more?
To be honest, actually, I think we're seeing a lot more manufacturers think about how they invest in that kind of retailer upskilling. And so what that means both from an EV perspective, but also from, I think you commented on earlier, that kind of more connected customer journey. So it's both making sure they understand how to sell an EV. And you are correct, it is a bit different. It's also probably just different for the retailer itself in terms of the journey of ownership once they've sold it. Because the reality is there are less parts in an electric vehicle. So actually a lot of that maintenance is a bit different. How you interact then with the consumer when maybe you're not bringing them in quite as regularly or in the same kind of style for maintenance as you might, assuming you kind of continue that maintenance journey if you're a retailer. And so there's a lot to be thought through with that. And everything from the earlier point, which is a lot of those consumers are doing research online before they even walk in the dealership. I mean, the honest answer, before you go to a retailer now, almost no one is walking in without having kind of picked a lot of the model, make and model and choices in the vehicle that they're thinking about, right? And so how do you connect all of that with someone who also understands the electric vehicle journey and ownership model? And so I think all of that is really complex. And to answer your point, yes, I think we see OEMs starting to make that. possibly they should have done it a bit faster, but I think the reality is there's been a lot of change lately.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, too much. And then you think you've settled down and then something else there's a few curveballs coming at us with other things, not just, EV changes. But so with that in mind and how we help consumers make those decisions, because you're absolutely right. I think we do so much shopping online before we walk in. We never just walk in. But I do think there's probably a gap. And you've mentioned as well about connected vehicles and how that starts to show through in your app and how you start to use apps more to run your life. There feels to me like there's the ability to connect more of this up. So retailers can maintain a relationship. It's just a different relationship. So we see now OEMs working with their network to think about how do you reskill and re-engineer your garages so you're not just servicing petrol vehicles, but you're doing other things like smart repairs or tyre changes or EVHCs, so electric vehicle health checks. So how do you help consumers check the health of their battery? Because that's another little anxiety that we didn't think we needed to have. We didn't think that was a thing until, like, is my battery okay? Does it charge to what it says it should? No. So I think there's lots of other things that we can help the industry try and just think about differently and how we start to connect up. How does your tariff work with because we now have the ability with people like Octopus, their technology is incredible. You can start to connect up how much it's costing you at home or when you're outside of home. So just thinking about then the big trends that are coming down the pipes, because we talked about having to think about manufacturing 20 years ago, but for what we're seeing now, what are we going to see in the next 5, 10, 15 years coming down the pipes? I mean,
It's definitely not a big question at all, Jackie.
yeah, world predictions, no pressure.
Look, I think the key things we are going to see is I think we're going to see realistically consolidation. We've talked about that. So I think you're going to see some brands consolidating. I think you're probably going to see, quite honestly, more individuals starting to make an investment in. I think you'll see more EVs. I think we will see it continue to grow, even if we have some kind of the initial choice of consumers would prefer to maybe go back to a hybrid or other. Whether they have that choice is a different question. So I think you're going to see it continue to grow. I think you are going to see more clarity coming out from OEMs, from retailers, from other groups who are setting up like a Charge UK, whoever it might be, really looking to drive understanding of what exists and what the options are. I don't think we're expecting to see any major changes in the vehicle itself. You're going to see some new battery technology coming out, which should make people even more confident, quite honestly. Probably a lot of what will start to change is how connected everything continues to be, which will be more and more connected. But also I would say we're going to start to see some of the OEMs make real choices around what I should say is what we're going to start to see is more changes in ownership models. So I think we're still often thinking about, when you make a choice to purchase an EV, well, we haven't touched upon the fact that actually most EVs aren't purchased these days, especially in the UK, right? They're via car schemes. And so whether that's through your work, other avenues, not many people are going out and actually like making that purchase decision with ownership in mind. And so actually, what do the different models and subscription models, et cetera, start to look like? I think we'll see a lot more diversity coming with that actually in the coming kind of 5-10 years as well.
Yeah, I think so. When I don't know how long ago it was, the whole ACES, the autonomous, connected, electric, shared, that was like a prediction, the whole Tomorrow's World. I grew up in the days of Tomorrow's World. I love that program. But it was I think some of those, like the curveball of COVID, probably it meant that the sharing of vehicles didn't really happen probably as quickly as we thought it would. But again, conceptually, in cities, in urban spaces. My kids, 2 of my boys are now in London, one's at uni, one's at college, and they've discovered the Lime bike thing, which is fantastic. So now, middle boy gets a Lime bike, which means he hasn't got to walk to his train, he gets an earlier train. So that's changed his life. So I think we're going to start to see these generations think very differently, whereas the traditional owners, where we live in villages and need a vehicle, probably still needing to have a vehicle. I know I certainly have to have one. I couldn't use one. But if I was travelling, absolutely I could. So when you say we're going to see the ownership models and things changing, and you're right, most EVs are now funded through salary sacrifice schemes, which are potentially going to change. So I think we're going to see, I mean, what does that mean? If they're changing, what does that mean? Are we going to suddenly see a drop in, because again, it's another government thing. It's like an own goal.
Look, I don't think we're ever going to see volumes go back up to where they were pre-COVID, right? That's never going to happen. I think what we're still seeing settle out, and I don't know if I want to make big predictions on, but pre-COVID, we would have said that by 2050, I think it was something like 75-80% of the world's populations would be in metropolitan areas. Well, clearly in the UK, we've seen a shift away from people moving into cities throughout COVID and immediately after. Do we think that will shift back at some point? I actually haven't seen a whole lot of discussion about that yet. I think probably yes, in all honesty. I think we're seeing that shift back to kind of more work in the office versus work from home. And so what will that drive at the same times in terms of, how many people need a vehicle, whether you're a 1-car or a 2-car home, if not more. And so some of those choices, I think, is what we're going to see kind of start to shake out with probably a bit more clarity over the next 5 to 10 years. And I would say, actually, you say it's an urban choice around whether you own a vehicle or not versus kind of depending on where you sit. Look, the reality is we still have a real struggle in the UK with younger generations even getting their license. So, and that's not necessarily massively different depending on where you are in the country.
Mm.
So I think we'll see when we talk about those different ownership models, those who get a license alongside kind of cost of living in general, I think, I could open up 4 different apps on my phone right now. And yes, I'm London based, but 4 different apps that would give me options to have a car in the next hour. And I could use it for a period of time. And I think we see that going out more and more across the country, those different optionality of that. So I'm not so sure that it's going to be exclusionary to those who are living kind of outside the major urban areas. I think we're going to see a lot more investment in making that possible.
I think the prediction is actually, you're right, more urbanisation is going to happen, but also population is going to decrease. So we're never going to see the levels of manufacturing that we needed because you don't have the humans that are going to need those vehicles. And if we are kind of living more in cities, then you're right, it's going to just keep changing, isn't it? So thinking about the kind of the global transformation in customer experiences, we've seen a number of OEMs try different models and then maybe shift and flex a little bit. What do you see as being the biggest impact in that space in terms of tech transformation or connecting up data points?
I think the technology exists, right? So it's kind of like we talk a lot about autonomous. Well, the technology for autonomous exists, actually. A lot of it is what choices are made to enable it. And I mean, that's regulatory probably more than anything at this point. But I think to your specific question, I would say, well, actually, it's more about, to me, it's very much a question of margin and power within this. And the reality is, I think retailers have a whole lot of power in terms of delivering that experience, as you say, but also they have a lot of information about what the consumer wants that probably could be fed back significantly better to the OEM. And then there's something to be said for how the OEM pushes out the right information as well. So I think it's historically been probably viewed as a very one-way push from OEM to the retailer and then out the door. And I think what we are seeing is a lot more thought about what does an ecosystem look like, and maybe not just against kind of the retailer and the OEM, but also different financing options. Not every OEM has their own kind of financing in place. So I think if we look across that, that's where I think we're going to start to see a lot more of them open up to how they need to think about that and think of sharing of information both ways with that. The technology exists. The reality is it's back to the investment point. And there just is going to have to be some investment made to make that more viable. Who fully makes that investment is probably a little bit of the question on the table.
That's a really good point. You're right, though. The ecosystem as we see it now it's still quite siloed, and there's such an opportunity to connect it all up and to hand the baton on. So we were talking at an event last week about how do you take a customer from after sales, which has historically been the poor relation, but actually it's where your loyalty really happens. So those retailers do have such a power with their consumer experience to then bring you back into your repurchase journey. And that's the bit where you go, great, let me help this person connect with this person, or help this data connect with this data to know when to trigger the next event. So we kind of look at how do you trigger events across systems so that this thing knows when this is going to be relevant. So yeah, I think that you're absolutely right about the investment point. It's going to be for the greater good. How do we give the best experience and connect up this very disconnected ecosystem is a it's a challenge that keeps us both very employed.
I mean, I think realistically the OEMs have spent a lot of time thinking through this with their suppliers possibly first.
Mm-hmm.
And probably, it's interesting. I was at CES in Las Vegas back in January. And one of the things that was asked as we think about kind of AI and Gen AI more broadly, and this isn't automotive specifically, but it was a view that actually traditional IT departments are going to have to shift how they think about their role and actually instead of just delivering technology, they're going to have to be an orchestrator of multiple players in an ecosystem and actually take on how they manage other organizations and partners, collaboration opportunities, different types of workforce. And so I think that's quite similar for every organization right now, not just in a Gen AI space, but actually more broadly. No longer are we looking at business models that are just kind of an OEM or any business sitting by themselves in a silo. Actually, they all have to be thinking really differently about both supplier, retailer, other collaboration partners, how they get their consumers in. And it's just a completely different journey for them.
The AI topic is going to be huge, isn't it? We've seen a couple of, just in earlier interviews for this podcast, we started to talk about retailers just getting their brain around digital transformation. And now we're throwing AI in the mix, and generative AI and agentic AI. So there's a whole, I'm imagining that's going to keep a lot of you very busy within your space. How can the industry get ready for that, do you think? What can we do to help them?
Do you know, I had the pleasure of joining an SMMT event probably back last summer. And one of the questions I had was, well, how do we take an industry that arguably possibly is on the older generation side, actually for a lot of the workforce. Yes, we have some younger generations coming in and we're looking to see, well, the industry is looking to drive more of that. But how do you get people that get more comfortable with that AI transition that's happening? And how do you upskill people who might be really uncomfortable with something that's really different? So yes is the honest answer. I think there's nothing easy. I think things like reverse mentoring, things like actually getting kind of people to principal and kind of almost change coach across the business are all great answers. But actually, this is going to be a big challenge for organizations over the next another 5 to 10 year prediction. But it's probably not moving as fast in some ways as people might think. I think we hear a lot about it, but I would say most organizations I'm seeing, which gives confidence, are taking a really thoughtful approach to how and when they bring AI into their business and how they use it in their business, because there's a lot of risks that come with it as well. So it's nice to see a little level of kind of responsibility around that.
I think I've seen that definitely. There's and the other thing about AI, and we've talked about this, is you can, if you think about how you like what do you do now and what's the wouldn't it be great if, so how do you kind of iterate in an agile way? So we do that thing, we do it really well, we learn from it, and then we'll do the next thing, we do it really well. Like the reverse mentoring is basically learn from people that know what they're doing. Like bring in those humans and help them to develop your strategy. But all of that AI, for it to be accurate, needs an accurate source of data. So it could be, how can you automate? And this is where we're going to start to see real efficiency. How do you automate your workshop? How can you automate just-in-time ordering? So what can you learn from other industries where they start to machine learn and optimize the process? That's really what it is, I think, in simple terms. And it's making it feel like you don't get overwhelmed. And I think we've seen a lot of overwhelm with tech. People kind of go, don't know what I'm doing, not going to do anything, I'll just keep doing it. And they're still moving around bits of paper. You're like, really? You don't need to move anything around on a bit of paper. You can just digitally document, sign everything and store it safely. And then you can access it. So I think the AI topic is going to be huge, but take the time to learn one thing at a time and then just start to, I think, overlay that with an ecosystem. Work with a consulting firm that can help you kind of like, expand out your team, or find humans that know the special subject and give you the skill that you need. So yes, there's some cool stuff. Is there anything else in your world that you think, Sarah? I know we're kind of wrapping up the interview really, but that you think either from the retail space or in the whole, whether it's OEMs or retailers, because we kind of sit between those, and also the financing companies, that you think they should be really leaning into in 2025?
It's interesting. I was reflecting as you were just speaking that if I could go back, and one of the earlier questions you asked me was, where should OEMs start? And I don't think this is just OEMs, but actually the reality is, I've said it a few times, there are cash constraints for all these organizations that we've talked about. And so being really sharp on where you're going to get your margin to be able to invest in all of the things we've talked about has to be one of the top areas that you become really clear on. And whether that's your retailers, really understanding where that margin is coming from, what that looks like, to the OEMs, to, as you say, the financing departments, which have historically been where a lot of margin will come in, depending on who owns them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that has to be, if an organization isn't clear on that yet, that has to be where there's a focus on this year. And then alongside that, I would say, I mean, to be honest, you just said it yourself, data is needed for all of this. And bluntly, it's one of the least sexy things that you can do because it takes investment and it takes complex time, but it will enable everything else you want to do in the future. So again, getting your data cleaned up, understanding where it sits. It's probably the number one complaint of most clients I talk to is that they need to do it and they know it's going to be painful and they know it's going to be costly. But everything else we've talked about will be enabled by that. And so if you haven't started that journey, quite honestly, suck it up and just do it. You gotta have to.
It's true. I mean, we spent probably, in 2023, 24, just doing the data job because it was so disconnected. So actually having your data fields mapped in a way that means you can then build everything on top of that. You can't do anything unless you've got your data in a place where you can access it. And we're still going through that process. And it's an ongoing process, that data cleansing and not double keying. So we hear a lot about how do you have your systems connected so that you key it once and everything else automatically updates. And the technology exists to be able to do that. You just need to synchronize where your events are being triggered and what happens. So it's absolutely right. Suck it up and get it right. To your point, coin that, put it on a t-shirt. But it's true, isn't it? Oh, you're right. It's unsexy. It's like after sales, unsexy, but drives loyalty, drives profit.
Yeah.
Data, unsexy, drives great ecosystems, drives profit.
Yeah.
I think that's the bit where we have to, the uncomfortable truth is we're living in a fairly small margin business.
Yes.
But it's a huge amount of turnover and we can start to really drive inefficiency now. We can drive better efficiency now.
And and I talk to a lot of organizations and it's really interesting. I think sometimes out kind of broader than maybe a company, there's a view that like talking about profit, people don't want to talk about profit. Well, the reality is profit is what enables you the ability to invest in all the other things you want to do.
Yeah.
And so every organization needs to have some focus on that, if not quite a large amount of focus on that, to be able to invest in new battery technology, invest in the new connected services that make the most sense, invest in retailer training, any of these things that it has to come back to that.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. It's been fantastic having you in the studio.
Jackie, it's always a real pleasure to be able to take a time and have a chat with you. So thanks for having me.